Hello, I'm Dr. John Rex, and I'm here to answer your burning questions about AMR. So, one of the quirky things about antibiotics is that they have an economic model that actually makes it really almost stupid for somebody to want to invent an antibiotic. Let me see if I can explain the idea. So, the thing about having an antibiotic is that you want to use it when you have an infection, and you don't want to use it otherwise. And indeed, you want to use, if you will, the least possible antibiotic for any given infection. So if I can treat your infection with an ordinary older antibiotic, you didn't get some quirky, difficult, highly resistant bug, I ought to use the old antibiotic, because every time you use an antibiotic, you drive a little bit of resistance. So you know, sort of a finite number of times we can use any given antibiotic. So the concept here is if I invent a really good, a wonderful new antibiotic, you have this quirky thing that happens, which is everybody says, that's wonderful. I am so proud of you. Fantastic job, young man, for inventing that new antibiotic. It's important. As a matter of fact, it's so important, we're not going to use it. We're going to save it for the person who absolutely must have that. And if you think about it, that actually makes perfectly good sense from the standpoint of preserving the antibiotic. Problem is that for the person who has invented the antibiotic, right now the only way we get paid if we are the inventor of an antibiotic is if there's a human being who's got an infection and we put the antibiotic into them. And that's how we pay for every other drug, right? You don't pay for an antihypertensive unless you've got hypertension. There's no point in it. But antibiotics are different in that antibiotics have a value when you use them to treat an infection, but they also have a value when you think of them as being like fire extinguishers. So having a fire extinguisher or an antibiotic makes it safe to be in a building, to get surgery. Think about that. So antibiotics, by the fact that they exist in the pharmacy, make it safe to go into the hospital and have a new hip put in. Without the antibiotic, you really shouldn't do it. Without the fire extinguisher, please don't do any deep fat frying, okay? So the concept here is that antibiotics, they make it possible to take care of you, but we only pay for them when you get into trouble. Well, that means that the use actually, in theory, should be very low. The use if defined as treating somebody. But what about the use defined as making it safe to have the, being prepared to have that tool available? That's the key problem. And there's been a lot of discussion over this. There was a problem that we as a community didn't really fully recognize until about 15, 20 years ago. And we started to probe it really over the last 15 years and came to realize that we needed to talk about the mechanisms that caused antibiotics to be developed somewhat differently from other drugs. And so these days we use two ideas. We use an idea called push and pull. Push in antibiotic terms means the idea that I encourage you to go and start a company. I do that by providing some grant money. It's actually, there's rather a lot of money these days available if you'd like to start a little company. There's a group called CARB-X that has money that comes from the United States, that comes from Wellcome Trust, it comes from it comes from some other countries around the world. There's another program called Novo Repair. It's pretty easy to round up 10, 20, $30 million or so to do the work that would begin to discover an antibiotic. But the problem you hit is that once you get into the more expensive later phases, phase 2, phase 3, and then getting it onto the market, you discover that actually there's no value in the antibiotic because the problem we discussed earlier. I invent a new antibiotic, people say, that's great. I'm not going to put it into human beings. I'm not going to pay you to put it into human being because I want to save it. And the practical consequence of that is that in the United States, there have been 15 drugs approved since about 2009. 5 of them are in bankruptcy or the equivalent thereof because once they got onto the market, the sales were so low that they could not cover the cost of making the drug and keeping it on the market. if I'm going to keep an antibiotic on the market, I'm going to need something in the range of $25 to $35 million a year to maintain the drug in the market. I've got to make it, keep it fresh. There's always a bunch of sort of work that has to go on around it, a little bit of studies that you have to do on the side. You know, round figures, what I say is you need $350 million over the first 10 years just to break even. Pull models are something we're only gradually figuring out how to put in place. And the country that's doing the leading job, if you will, in the world of implementing pull models is the United Kingdom. And they have spent the last 5 years working on the question of what's it worth to have a fire extinguisher in the pharmacy that I could use if an outbreak due to a really resistant bacteria occurred. What's it worth? And their math says that for the UK, the value is about 10 million pounds a year. And so the experiment they're doing right now, it's a very exciting pilot project. They are looking for 2 good antibiotics. And they'd like to buy these 2 antibiotics at 10 million pounds a year for about 10 years. About $100 million pounds to be paid over 10 years for each of 2 good antibiotics. And the interesting thing about this is to do the math. 100 million pounds over 10 years. So the UK as an economy is about 3% of the G20. So if you scale it up by 33-fold, 100 million pounds becomes 3 billion pounds. Turn that into dollars, $4 billion approximately. And that's actually the value that we have estimated via a number of mechanisms of a really good new antibiotic to the global community. So what the UK has said is our fair share of a new kind of high-end antibiotic fire extinguisher is 10 million pounds a year for 10 years. And we're going to experiment with buying 2 of them. In the United States, there's a bit of legislation called the Pasteur Act, named after Louis Pasteur. It's a great acronym, that is going to try to do the same thing. It's going to be, it sets aside about $11 billion to be used to buy a handful of new antibiotics over a period of time, about a decade or so. So the U.S. is saying, you know, we're about half of the G20. You think about buying 4 or 5 antibiotics, it might be that we're putting, you know, $2 or $3 billion into each of, you know, a few antibiotics along the way. Again, you get to this number of around $4 billion is the value of a new fire extinguisher to the global community. It's the kind of thing that would prevent you from having a catastrophic outbreak in an intensive care unit. So this is the idea of pull. And we spent a lot of time developing this concept via a variety of projects that we did over the last decade. And the thing you come back to over and over again is antibiotics, as the fire extinguishers of medicine, are something that you need to have available on the shelf. To have them available on the shelf, you have to pay for it. You can't have a fire department if you don't pay the fire people a salary. You can't have an antibiotic if you don't pay for the cost of creating the antibiotic. And you have to sustain that. You can't stop. You can't say, I don't think I need a fire department this year. It just doesn't work that way. You've got to constantly maintain it. So with antibiotics, what we've worked out is that the global community needs to pull them into existence by paying for the value that they offer in terms of creating our economic well-being. The whole thing about feeling comfortable about going and having your medical procedures is it's safe. So that's the idea. Push is the idea of putting in grants and sorts of things, and that's relatively small numbers of dollars. You need a lot of projects. Most of the projects won't discover anything, but that's how discovery is. It takes a long time. And you need bigger sums at the other end for the handful of new antibiotics that get invented. And each one of those needs to be bought with what we call a pull mechanism, sometimes called a market entry reward. Like, comment, and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.